I'm just waiting for the cue.
I'm waiting for you, so tell me when.
Yeah, I'm waiting because Google Meet takes like 2 seconds. Zoom takes a little bit longer. I'm just probably another 10 seconds, it looks like here.
How long do you?
Thanks for joining us. Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast network, the voice of the Jewish community.
Takes a little bit longer. I'm just
welcome to the podcast.
Here.
You are now tuned in to this episode of our podcast. Today, we are going to interview some of the greatest and most influential minds in our field.
Thanks for joining us.
And now, please welcome your host.
Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast. You're listening to Talkline voice Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
You are now tuned in to this episode of our podcast. Today, we are going to interview some of the greatest and most influential minds in our field.
Thanks for joining us.
And now, please welcome your host.
Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast. You're listening to Talkline voice Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
You are now tuned in to this episode of our podcast. Today, we are going to interview some of the greatest and most influential minds in our field.
Thanks for joining us.
And now, please welcome your host.
Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast. You're listening to Talkline voice Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
You are now tuned in to.
Okay. We're back. It was the first time I'm using Zoom for YouTube, so we apologize for the inconvenience, some of the technical issues. Okay, we are back. I'm very pleased to join us right now from Israel. He's a prominent journalist. He's currently with Globes, which is a business publication. He serves as op-ed editor. He was formerly with other publications. He's worked for elected officials. He has his finger on the pulse of Israeli society. So Ariel Whitman, originally from Brooklyn, New York. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Zev. It's good to be with you.
Thank you. So let's begin. There's so much going on in Israel. You've covered the war. You've covered the Haredi divide in Israel. You cover the business, the economy. So first of all, what is the spirit in Israel today?
Well, I guess first of all is there's like a sort of a split between how people feel on the one hand towards the government itself and how people feel about being an Israeli and the war and just fighting with Hamas and all that kind of stuff. So on the one hand, you have the weekly protests. Now even sometimes there's like sort of a split, especially since the hostages were killed the last week. The 6 hostages had basically every single day protest. We've had the unions, the largest union group, the Histadrut, that shut down the country for about 6 hours. And then the courts told them that they can't, it's a political strike, so they brought them back to work. You've had blocking of streets, and that's on the one hand, where basically I would say over 50% or more of the country, more or less, really doesn't trust the government, really feels that the government is not on their side. I think you could also probably track that back to the protests before October 7th with the judicial reform bill. Pretty much the divide line is the same. The people who protest against the government in October 6th or in October 5 are the same people pretty much that are protesting now against Netanyahu. It's just coming out now, I think.
So no, is it political, or these are people who are really concerned about the hostages? What you're saying, it sounds like there are a lot of people who are hijacking the hostage issue to make a political point.
Well, I think that people who are anyway against the government are more predisposed to anyway think that the government isn't doing enough. So it's a little bit of both. There obviously are people that are, you called it hijacking, or using the issue to promote their agenda against the government. There are also a lot of people that don't like the government anyway, and this is another reason that they feel the government isn't doing enough. And the poor hostage families in the middle are caught, and some of them are in the protest. I know a lot of hostage families that feel the protests are actually hurting their cause. So if you ask me personally, I think that Hamas, our world works on incentives, and when a terrorist organization sees that the country that the hostages are coming from, the country is being so divided, so split on the issue, the pressure is so much on the government, it makes the incentive for them to come to the table and negotiate in good faith is very, very low. So that's just my personal opinion, and there are numerous hostage families that have this opinion. So the hostage families are themselves on two different tracks, on a lot of these issues. So it's actually a very sad situation if you think about it. On the other hand, like I said, when it comes to the actual goals of the war, the actual objective of winning the war, there's a lot more unity. And you see that in some of the polls. So last week, the organization called the Mediniyut Am Yehudi, I forgot how they're called in English, they put out a poll which basically asked a lot of the negotiations now are around the Philadelphia corridor. And they asked, Hamas basically is demanding that Israel leave the corridor. That's their number one objective. And Netanyahu was against it. And they asked people whether they support leaving the corridor or or for the hostages or staying there. And over 50% of Jewish Israelis said that they were for staying in the corridor. And the reason being is that most Israelis, when they're explained to it, what is the consequences of leaving the border, they'll be against it, because at the end of the day, there is a consensus or a broad coalition that supports winning the war. Whatever that means, we could get into it.
But can you win the war and free the hostages at the same time? I'm not sure. That sounds like it's a good goal, but is it attainable? Is it achievable?
It's a good question. We don't know. We do know that what does it mean to free all the hostages? Probably not, but also in the actual deal that's being proposed now, all the hostages won't be released also. The deal proposes three different stages. In the first stage is the humanitarian stage, which is for about 40 to 50 days of a ceasefire, and only about 30 live or dead hostages will be released. And after that, there's a negotiation for the full stop of the war, which will release the other remaining live hostages, which are the men, the able-bodied men, and the soldiers who are alive. And then there'll be, and the third part of the deal will be exchange of bodies. And so even if you support releasing all the hostages, let's say, and ending the war, you're not going to get that in the first stage. And you'll have to really trust Hamas to live up to its deal, and to trust the terrorist organization that's continually lied throughout this conflict and before, obviously, is I think not such a great deal and not smart. But again, that's just my opinion. I think a lot of people in the streets think that they've had enough. The number one goal for them is to release the hostages.
But they use that Hamas is not offering to release all. They're only going to do partial.
Exactly.
They're going to play games with dead and live hostages. They claim they don't know how many hostages are alive. And now I also heard that Sinwar, the head of Hamas, wants not to be killed. Can't they make a deal where they say, you want to live? Everybody out.
Well, they can make a deal. The question is if
Fully live up to it, right? That's
I think that there's been numerous sort of opinions about Sinwar. One of the things that we have that I think is obvious, we've just found a letter that Sinwar wrote to his people around Sinwar, supposedly wrote the German newspaper, The Bild, just published it last week, about how basically the strategy of Hamas is to destroy Israel from within. They know they're very good at understanding Israeli society. Sinwar was for 20 years in this prison. He speaks fluent Hebrew. He studied in an Israeli university. He knows the rifts inside Israeli society. We see how they're using the hostage issue to just create tensions within the Israeli society, and it's working. It's working. Every few days they'll release the video of a hostage. They'll release the body. They'll do all these things to create people in Israel not to be
a division. They want to sow division,
and it's working.
It's working. And by the way, part of the problem is that Sinwar was saved by an Israeli doctor, and he warned Israeli intelligence, don't let this man go. He's dangerous. He was ignored. And that's the problem when you release so many terrorists. And I understand you want to save Jews, you're going to let these people with blood on their hands out there, but you know they're going to kill again. That's the big issue.
And it's not even that. Just to remind people that a few weeks ago, a terrorist that actually tried to kill Israelis was eliminated. The IDF killed him in the West Bank because he was trying to kill Israelis in the West Bank with weapons. And this terrorist was released in the first deal that was done with Hamas in I think it was August. Remember, December or January, I forgot exactly. The first deal where they got 100 hostages out. One of the released prisoners, they said, we're not releasing murderers, but a lot of the people they released were people who tried to kill Israelis but weren't successful. And so they released them and were ready. They're going back to be terrorists. They're going back to try to kill Israelis again. And so we have to, even if you support any deal, the fact is that it's not a free deal. The dangers here are immense. And we learned that in the Shalit deal. Sinwar was released. He's now in charge of all the terrorism that we've been seeing since October 7th and before. Numerous of the terrorists that have been killed in Hamas, in Gaza, and in Lebanon, by the way, were released in the deal. Uri, for example, was released right before the deal, but I think as part of the deal. In Shalit, he was in charge of he was assassinated in Lebanon. He was in charge of the terrorism in the West Bank, funneling money, directives from Iran, and etc. So we have to understand the price that we're going to pay. Besides ending the war, which would be catastrophic for just the way Israel's being looked at by other countries around. Iran sees that Hamas could, tire Israel out from winning. What does it mean for Iran itself or Hezbollah? Besides that, there's also the practical of terrorists being let out that want to kill Jews. And so,
Well, let me ask this question, Ariel. It always bothered me that you have these terrorists who've killed many Jews. Shouldn't there be a death penalty? If there would be, it would resolve some of these terrorists with a lot of blood on their hands from getting out because they would have been executed for crimes against humanity and killing Jews.
I agree. And one thing that's little known is that there is a death penalty on the books in Israel. It's just that the death penalty needs to be applied by the judges. I think it has to be, I'm not a legal expert, but if I understand correctly, the death penalty in Israel has to be unanimous by all the judges on the panel. And that there has been cases where some of the judges were decided to give the death penalty, but not unanimously. And so that's why it never was happened except for Eichmann. We also, the laws that were proposed by people in the Knesset were to make it that it doesn't have to be unanimous decision. And yeah, I agree 100%. A lot of these terrorists that are sadistic, disgusting trash need to be killed. And that way a lot of the incentive to kidnap Israelis goes out the drain because there is no extremists or leaders that are available to be released in the first place.
Our guest is here from Israel, originally from Brooklyn, New York, now resident of Israel, worked for various publications, elected officials. He's now the op-ed editor for Globes, a leading business publication in Israel, but he covers not only finances, but also politics and the war. You're originally from Brooklyn. You grew up in a Haredi home in Crown Heights. So you're not Haredi today, even though you're Orthodox, you're a Zionist. How do you view the divide in Israel regarding the Haredim serving in the army? It seems that it's reached a certain crescendo. I don't know what it is now. It seems maybe quiet down a little bit, but what's happening with that?
Well, two things that we have to put in mind is that it's not just the army, it's also the economy. So before October 7th, I wrote a lot about how the Israeli economy is going to, because the demographic changes. So you have an ultra-Orthodox Haredi community, which is growing extremely fast. And on the other hand, you have the Zionist religious and the secular Jews the population is growing. Israelis tend to have kids much more than Americans or Europeans, but at a lower rate than
Are the Zionist religious Jews, they don't have the same amount of kids as Haredim? I thought there were big numbers with them.
Big numbers, but less. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but less, significantly less. Also, it depends if you want to get into it. The Zionist religious Jews you could split them into three different ways. You have the Chardalim, which are the more extreme in terms of the religiosity inside the Zionist organization. They're even more closer to the Haredim than some of the Zionist religious. You have the mainstream that are pretty much in the middle, people that live next to me in Petah Tikva. And then you have the more liberal Zionist religious, who are the more people who want to do more reforms inside the way the religious community works, to be more liberal and more progressive, let's say. But in general, the Chardalim would have more kids and the other groups would have less. But in general, yes, I think 1 or 2 kids less. And the Haredim have 6 or 7 kids on average per family, which is unbelievably a lot for a specific demographic that's growing so fast. It's not like in the US that there's so many people here. In Israel, there's a lot less people. And so especially when you have an entire community that's growing fast, that's going to be a larger percent of the population that is almost entirely reliant on government assistance, and that over 50% of the male population of the Haredi community does not work in Israel. That is a recipe for a disaster. And
the reason they don't work because the employment comes from working in the army. You get all the skills and the connections being in the army, right?
Okay.
That's helpful.
Not only that obviously helps, but also the fact that they don't want to work. They're staying in Kolelim until a lot of them are Torato Monato, which means legally they, on the one hand, don't go to the army, but are barred from working because once they stop being in the yeshiva, then they have to go to the army, and none of them want to go to the army, so they stay in yeshiva and then they don't work. And also because they don't want to work. The fact is that the Haredi community since the 1970s, since Rav Shach, has been almost around the Chevrat HaLomdim. So the people who are the way the society is constructed is around going to yeshiva for your whole life. If you can't be in yeshiva, then maybe go to work. Depends on who your rabbi is. But the actual way that the society is constructed are that the people in yeshiva, those are the best. That is the way to live from cradle to grave, how they say in America, the way the welfare state is. That's the way it works. And so you have over 50% of men in the Haredi community that aren't employed, not even part-time. And the women are employed. But the problem is that, first of all, the quality of jobs is very, very low. The percentage of women, Haredi women, who are working in the education field is extremely high. I have nothing against education, but at the end of the day, the salaries are much lower than what secular or religious Israelis would be working in. And the amount of women who work part-time jobs because they're going to pick up the kids and because they're being pregnant every few years. Again, nothing against it, but just that it influences the amount of work that you can do is very, very high. And so that is the Kohelet is a research organization from the right, not from the left. So they're not like biased against Haredim. They did a study that showed that even the top 8 percentiles of Haredim, so meaning Haredim that make a lot of money, as opposed to like other groups in the Haredi community, even they are reliant on government subsidies. Only the top 10% of Haredim are not reliant on government subsidies, just because of the amount of kids that they have, the lifestyle that they have, et cetera, et cetera. And that can continue. And then now take it to after October 7th, when we suddenly realized that not only do we have an economic problem that's in the long term or in the medium term, we have a problem right now where the army is saying that we don't have enough soldiers. We have 2 fronts right now, the Gaza war, the Lebanon war. The army has lost thousands of soldiers to either death or injuries where they can't go back to battle. I myself know 3 soldiers that passed away in reserves. I know at least 10 people who were in the army that lost limbs. Every Israeli who's not Haredi knows someone, at least one person who either was critically wounded, lost limbs, or passed away, sadly. And the people in Israel like me are saying, I supported letting you off the hook for going to the army so you could go to work. But right now that didn't work. But right now we have a problem right now. We are under existential threat. I think everyone believes it, from Hamas, from Hezbollah, Iran, the Houthis. The West is turning on us. We don't have the privilege of people sitting in yeshiva at such a large number of people and not be taking part in society. I think it's also against the halacha, in my opinion.
Well,
But that,
1948, they actually fought. The
yeah,
Haredim fought in the war for independence. This is just as important as the war. The question was, though, what can be done? Because once you get politics involved, everybody's back stiffens and everybody
yeah,
takes an extremist position. I know our mutual friend Eli Paley from the Mishpacha magazine had a proposal that I like. He said on these airwaves that Haredi men, when they turn 25, should do homeland security, other areas where they could work. And I believe he got UJ Federation, other groups to involve them. I like the idea because you have to gradually get them in. But so far, I don't see anything happening. If anything, the positions are hardening.
yes. I would just say, first of all, that we have to say, before practicality, just on a moral level, that we have to tell the people, we have to, first of all, before we look for, in order to look for a solution, we have to first put on the table what our opinions are. So I think that, and what our moral, this is a moral issue. So it's the fact that the entire Israeli society is right now losing family, losing friends, being injured for life. And one part of Israeli society is not. And so we need to first identify the problem and say that that's not moral. That's not halachically fine. And there's enough rabbis, even Haredi rabbis, that are coming out a little bit and there's extreme backlash in the community. Not too long ago in Bnei Brak, there was a rabbi, I'm blanking on his name, but that he's called his community, whoever can't learn should go to the army. And they rushed into his house in Bnei Brak, and his wife told the local Haredi places that aren't controlled by the parties there, that she was scared for his life. The police had to go and evacuate him from his own home. And so even we have to say that there is a culture of silence because people are scared of the extremists in the Haredi community, and that needs to be called out. And then when you ask about practicality, so I think, again, I think that there is no real solution. Even Eli's solution, that the way you just phrased it, is that at the end of the day, 18-year-old Israelis are going to the army, and 25-year-old Israelis, if they will agree to it, because at the end of the day, you're not going to send police into Bnei Brak to catch people who are at such a large scale not going to the army. And I think it'll have to come from within the Haredi community.
But that's why I
And
like it. But here's the thing, though, that because the status quo was whatever the reasons why, and it grew, and nobody expected it to be the way it is today, but you can't just go and change everything overnight. It has to be gradual.
yeah.
If you start at 25 and eventually you can go to 20 and 18. But is the Army really equipped to have 50,000, 100,000 Haredim where you need special meals, special units? I'm not sure. Listen, I understand the need for them to be in the Army, but is the Army really equipped to handle Haredim in big numbers?
Well, right now we're not even asking for big numbers. Let's get 1,000 in.
Well, you
And
have
I think,
already has over 1,000.
yeah, the Nachal Haredi is almost all not Haredim. Let's put the actual thing. They're mostly Hardalim, Zionist religious Jews that want to be more strict halachically in the army, which is fine, but it's a little bit of a misconception to say that most of them are Haredim. Most of them are not Haredim. But I'll also say, and I think the army is equipped. The army is trying to get the different solutions. And if the ultra-Orthodox, it's not the, if the Haredim, their leaders and the members of Knesset will be working with the army and telling and trying to fit the needs, it would be working. They're not. There's a disconnect between all of the people in Israel. I would just say, in terms of a solution, I think, again, we spoke about incentives. We should be working on incentives here. One of the biggest incentives is financial support. We need to tell people, especially, okay, you don't want to go to the army, I'm against it, but our government should not be subsidizing people who don't work.
But they did. They did for a while. They stopped it, and I believe the Haredim went to America, raised $100 million in that
That was
ballpark
now.
vicinity. What?
That was, well, I would just say that if you want to raise money for, first of all, that was just now, like 2 months ago, so we don't know
Correct.
exactly. But the where it hurts is not for the yeshivas. Where it hurts is for people's own bank accounts, families. So when the Haredi leaders came to America and raised a lot of money, first of all, if the taxpayer isn't on the line, let them raise whatever they want. It's their prerogative. The taxpayer should not be forced to pay for this stuff, just like you shouldn't be forced to pay for a lot of other stuff that aren't religious. But this has an impact on people working and going to the army. But the money that was raised here was for yeshivas and kollalim in Israel. It was not raised for
Not for
people to,
families. What you're
not
saying.
raised for families, and not raised for, different
Well,
social benefits.
explain to me, Ariel. I know you're originally from the United States. Haredim in the United States do go to Kola, but they also work. You have a whole group. In fact, they're able to raise $100 million from within a week. Means that they're working. They're not just
Exactly.
Kola. I mean, they're in there and they're going to work after Kola. Why hasn't that happened in Israel?
Well, I think that first of all, it just shows that working is not against the Haredi ideology, because the fact that they were able to come to America to raise $100 million from other Haredim who work here I'm actually right now in New York, who work in New York. And so that just shows that they could also work in Israel, and they could also get a lot of money in Israel and contribute to the Israeli economy. So I think that in itself, even though they didn't want it to show, it shows. So and you asked how this happened and why it happens, and I think it's all about government policy. So until the 1970s, we had a few in our interview in our Hebrew podcast that I do. We had a few people who researched this. Until the 1970s, Haredim in Israel worked at the exact same rate as non-Haredim, men and women. What happened since the 1970s were that there is a total drop in the employment rate, both in men and women, and women has gone up since the 2000s. But what happened in the 1970s? Let's think about it. Number one, for the first time since the creation of Israel, since the first government that created the state of Israel, the Haredim were part of the coalition. Until the 70s,
With that, Menachem Begin came in around 1977.
77. Until 1977, the Haredim were not part of any coalition. Therefore, there was no political pressure to cave into their demands. Begin came in, the Haredim were part of the coalition, and right away he gave into a lot of their social welfare programs that they demanded. He put in a lot more money onto yeshivas and kollel. He made it much easier to not go to the army. He made the numbers much larger of the number that Ben Gurion allowed for a few hundred, and Begin made it much, much bigger and much easier to not go to the army and stay in yeshiva. And the second thing that happened is a little bit more interesting, is that until the 1970s, the Haredi community did not have one rabbi that did their whole hashkafa. There was a lot of different Haredim. There was Haredim in the 1948 war that were part of the army and were fighting all over Israel. There was Haredim that weren't. There was Haredim in Mea Shearim. There was Haredim in Bnei Brak. There was Haredim in Ashdod. All these Haredim were different people that had different rabbis, that had different ideologies. There was Haredim that were part of, there was Pai, excuse me. That was, Haredim that worked. They had a Knesset. They had a party in the Knesset. What happened since the 1970s was slowly but surely Rav Shach basically took over the entire ideology of the Haredi movement. There's a lot of different research about this, but the basic thing is that he was very much against being part of Israeli society, part of the labor market, and part of, obviously, the army. He was more for a closing up of society and not letting in the outside come in. And that basically took over the entire Haredi community. And so you had these two things: one, a sort of ideological, more of an extreme view onto Israeli society, and number two, money was able to make that way of living possible. That did not happen before, just because
money,
of
of course, coming from the state where they provided subsidy.
Because of the political.
And the unemployment have a role too, because employment dropped. That also was that a factor as well?
Yes, and what happened was we could see how incentives work, because when Netanyahu was the finance minister in 2003, he enacted very, very important reforms, but that were too little. But we could see already there how they made things work. So there was you get subsidies for each child that you would get, the subsidy would go higher, exponentially almost. And what happened was that Netanyahu cut very drastically the subsidies that parents were getting for children. And we saw two things happen. Now we know it's pretty much all the research shows is the Arab community in Israel, the number of children went extremely down. The Arab community in Israel has less children now than the Jewish community in Israel. And that started going down ever since Netanyahu cut the social benefits for children. And the Haredi community, there was a small drop, but not as significant as the Arab community, but still less children that they had. So we do know, again, we could discuss if that's the right way to go, but what it does show is that financial incentives do work. And the government, if it wants to do anything, would have to do something like that on different social benefits. It doesn't mean that there'll be less children, but it does mean that maybe people will go to work. And then once people go to work or get a job or go to university, and once that happens, their children will be more likely to go to the army. But again, the army needs money. We're fighting so many wars in the next few years.
Down Wall Street in Samaria. Ariel Whitman is our guest, Israeli journalist, op-ed editor of Globe, a business publication. He has a podcast called The Western Spirit. He also has his finger on the pulse. He worked for elected officials in the Knesset, so he knows about politics, he knows about finance, and he knows about what's happening. Let me ask you this, Ariel, because Israeli society is facing a lot of pressure, and one of them is the economic pressure. So because of the war, businesses have closed, people are not picking the produce. You no longer have cheap Palestinian Arab labor coming in, which they had. All these factors affect the economy. How is it doing now?
Well, first of all, one other thing that we have to remember is that there's like about 300,000 people that aren't in their homes. So not only are the government paying for hotels for them or apartments that because the government is paying their prices went way up. You have apartments in Tveria that cost 20,000 a month. They used to cost 4,000 or 5,000 because there's so much of a demand, and the government's also subsidizing it, so people know that they can ask for more. But also, all these people are not working. So you have 300,000 people left their jobs, left their businesses, deserted the city because the government asked them to desert the city, especially in the north. I think it was a big mistake also militarily to tell people to leave because it gave Hezbollah free rein to shoot at these at Kiryat Shmona, for example. They don't shoot at Nahariya and other places that might be basically the same distance because they know that if any civilian dies, Israel will respond strongly. They feel they have free rein to just destroy the city. So that was number one. But in terms of financial, so these people aren't working. It's hard for me to see how the North will come back strong fast after all this, even when the war and if the war ends soon. In terms of the debt of the government, it's going way up lately. The government is going to need to do a lot of cuts to the budget in the next budget. I think the finance minister is taking it very lackadaisically. He's not. I like him personally, but I don't think he's doing the right
Who's the
thing
finance
here.
minister? But that's Smotrich.
Yeah, I think that they need to be a lot more proactive in.
But they're getting a lot of bad press because of being more they consider the extreme right in Israel, right? He and Ben Gvir.
Yeah, I wish they would be extreme right on the economy, but that's where they're not being, because I'm very much a small government person. I think the government should be in charge of specific things, but not more than that. And they're not being extreme right on the economy. Maybe on other things, yeah, we could talk about that. I don't think it's extreme right on a lot of their demands on the hostage situation, as I said before. But the economy is suffering, and the government seems to just let things continue going. They just announced that they were going to do certain cuts in the budget. And right away, a lot of the ministers said, we won't let them cut our offices. And that's horrible because there's going to be cuts.
That's because it's across the board, right?
Right. And if there isn't cuts, there's going to be have to be either extreme debt or extreme tax hikes. And so so if the government officials of, let's say, the Ministry of the Moreshet, of the how do you call it, the Ministry of like Jewish culture or stuff like that, don't cut or even get totally disbanded. I think right now we have, just because of political concerns of giving politicians ministries, that we have like 8-9 ministries that could tomorrow be totally dismantled, and no one in Israel would even know about it, and it would just save the government, the country, a lot of money. Not as much as we need, but it's
helpful.
Yeah, and it would show also, dugma ishit. It would show that the government is willing to hurt its own political interests and that every Israeli should chip in. And one other thing that just in general, I mentioned, I think it's important to say, a country like Israel cannot make a mistake economically or security-wise, because security costs money. And if you don't have money, you're not going to be able to pay for the planes. You're not going to be able to pay for the tanks. You're not going to be able to pay for anything. And then once you can't do that, you will not be able to secure your people. And it's not like a country like Argentina could basically be almost destroyed. They had like 400 or 500% inflation. The country was crumbling. Okay, country crumbled. They have elections. They have protests. Everything somehow they're able to right the ship. Israel doesn't have time to right the ship. The ship is in water with waves all over, with enemies shooting at it. If we don't right the ship, even economically, we won't be able to survive as a country, as a thriving country. And so I think that when we talk about the economy, we have to realize how important it is. It's not just, people are going to pay more taxes, more debt, more this. Everything costs money. All the weapons that are being right now shot at Hezbollah, the Iron Dome defense system, the United States helps Israel a lot, but it's not enough. Israel needs to stand on itself, on its own. And so that is something that we tend to just overlook. And I think Friends of Israel were talking to a Jewish American radio show. And I think we have to tell our Jewish friends to, when you talk to Israeli politicians, when you hear them talking about how Israel is strong militarily, ask them how strong Israel is in the economy and what they're doing as politicians to make Israel stronger. Because if they're not working on that, they're not helping Israel also security-wise. And I think that's very important to say.
How important security, economies are all important things. How popular is the Netanyahu government? Would it survive a vote if elections were held today?
In the Knesset?
Not in the Knesset, as far as elections, if elections were held today.
I think Netanyahu if the elections were held today, he would probably lose. But that is one of the reasons why he's very, very reluctant to go to any election. And I think that as time goes along, there's two dynamics happening. Number one is that you have all these protests, and the mainstream Israeli is looking at the opposition that is right now in the streets and saying, maybe Netanyahu, I don't like him, but these people are crazy. A lot of the people in the streets, they're leaders of the people in the streets. I don't want to talk about in general people. And so he's people that were on the right, but on the soft right, that maybe went to Gantz in the polls right now after October 7th are thinking about it. And so that's why it's a little bit, it's a little bit problematic. I would say that if that Bennett and a few other people are probably going to come into the race when election will be called, and when that happens in the polls, the dynamics are much more against Netanyahu, which is why he's very worried about calling for an election. He feels that he needs a win in this war somehow or another, and that'll help him win in the actual elections. Right now, I think my father told me, and I think it's a good way to look at it, is that he feels that one of the reasons why maybe he's holding strong against all this pressure in the hostage deal is that there's a lot of people around him that think maybe this is his last time around. And he feels that
isn't there going to be accountability because the Israeli intelligence failed so miserably on his watch? Golda Meir had to resign after the Yom Kippur War. Others had to resign. So can he survive that once the war is over? I don't know. It would seem to me that a lot of leadership.
It all depends on how the war ends. But I do think that what happened on October 7th, after Yom Kippur, Golda Meir resigned, but Rabin won in her stead to be the next prime minister. People forget about it. And only in 77 was the Yom Kippur was in 73. So I think in 75 74 there was elections, and Rabin, who switched for Golda Meir at top of the labor, he won. And then only in 77 Begin wins. And so people look today at the Yom Kippur War and said it changed so many things in society, but it took time for it to change. And I think we're going to see a lot of in wake of October 7th. We don't even know the changes that are going to happen in the future, the political changes, the societal changes. But we do know that in the army, a lot of the officers have already resigned and asked for forgiveness. The head of the intelligence resigned. He asked for forgiveness. But Netanyahu, I think if we be honest with ourselves, he thinks that he can maybe get away with it. He thinks some of the people around him think that no, this is his last turn. But I think most of the people, and especially his family, that I think are very, very close to him, and they're the people that are at the end of the day, influencing a lot of his political decisions. They think that if he holds out, they're going to be maybe a win in the war somehow or another. They'll kill Sinwar. There'll be some sort of very good picture. There could be a lot of different scenarios, but at the end of the day, they want to try again. They think that he'll be able to try again, and so there's two different scenarios going on in his head. Two options. One is that maybe he thinks that this is his last turn, and therefore he's holding strong on some of these things because he has nothing to lose. And then the second thing is that no, he's doing it actually for political reasons to be more to Ben-Gvir and Smotrich's side to get some of their support maybe in the next election, to hold the coalition strong so that the election is pushed farther and farther away. And we'll see. But again, Bennett is going to come back in. He's very popular. The polls show that he's actually getting more
But does he have
seats
a
than
party? Naftali Bennett, what party would he have to form a new
I
one?
believe he'll have any party. He'll come with whatever party he needs.
Uh-huh.
To have a party in Israel, it's like switching socks. Wake up one day with one party, you go to sleep with the other,
But
everything's
he had a
fine.
base, originally had the base of the religious Zionists. He doesn't have that base anymore. He has
Yeah.
to.
He started off with the Beit Yehudi, then he went to Yamina, then he went to Yamina Chadash. There's a whole big thing. I think he switched like 4 parties. But I know that he's in talks with Lieberman to maybe form a mutual party. Lieberman's become very popular during this period of time in the polls. And so if Bennett decides to run and the polls are correct, Bennett has a government even without the Arabs that were there last time and without the Haredim and without the Likud. So
He's considered center left, but he's been more center right, I would say, right?
yeah, more center right. The interesting dynamic about Israeli politics is that the Israeli people moved very much to the right after October 7th in their opinions. But because Netanyahu himself is so popular, the left parties have taken more centrist positions and co-opted that vote. And so once someone who's right-wing but anti-Netanyahu, Bennett's more right-wing than Netanyahu on almost all the issues. Bennett never said he was for a Palestinian state. Netanyahu said that numerous times. Bennett was very, very hawkish on Iran, very hawkish on some of the other issues that Netanyahu was much more of a dove on. And so he's just anti-Netanyahu. And a lot of the people that were disappointed in Netanyahu, but can't bring themselves maybe to vote for Yair Lapid or maybe even Gantz and all that kind of, all those types of people. Yeah, so you might have a dynamic at the end where on the next election, you'll have an even more right-wing prime minister than we have today, but with a sort of center-rightish coalition.
And without Netanyahu's group him in the picture is what you're saying.
If Netanyahu leaves the Likud, let's say, if he loses, there's a good chance he'll leave. And then there's no reason for the Likud not to be in a coalition like that.
Final question. Simcha Rothman, he used to, before October 7th was very popular, judicial reform. I don't hear anything from him in America. Is he still popular in Israel? Is he still doing anything? What you hear about from the right is Smotrich and Ben-Gvir.
Well, we know in the past week and a half, Simcha's, I interviewed him on my podcast. He's
I have many times, yes.
Yeah, I knew him before he became a member of a Knesset. He was always a very big activist on these kind of stuff, of the judicial stuff. And so he never changed his position, not like other politicians. But in the past few weeks, the judicial reform, not bill, but some of the stuff has come up again in different ways. Simcha has been interviewed a lot. I hear him a lot. And I think that it would be a very big mistake politically for them to try anything with judicial reform. Levin seems to think this is the best time to do it. I think it would just be a disaster for the right. It would be a disaster for Israeli society, which anyways fractured like 100%. We're middle of a war. Stop it. That would be my just advice. Just as an Israeli citizen wants to live in peace, don't bring it up. Wait for the election. If you think that's an issue that Israelis want, run on it. I think you'll lose because Israelis had enough. They want quiet now. Maybe in the future. I think there's a lot of things that we need to change about the Israeli judicial system. In a lot of ways, it's a joke. That's my opinion, but not now, not like this, and with a bigger consensus and a much bigger when everything is much quieter on the security situation.
Ariel, a pleasure to have. We're going to have you on more often. You're certainly a nice perspective, interesting one, and passionate one about what's happening in Israel. Ariel Whitman is the op-ed editor at Glows, who also has a podcast called The Western Wind, right? The Western Spirit. Okay, Western Spirit. And that's in Hebrew and in English. People can catch it. So thank you for joining. I look forward to having you back again.
Thank you so much, Zev. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, the pulse beat of the Jewish community.
For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Zev, do you hear me?
I hear you now. Yes. Good.
It was a pleasure. It was fun.
It was great. It was a great interview. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm going to eat lunch.
No, my pub. Let's be in touch and let's
Yeah,
move
yeah.
forward
I'll
with some
talk to you on
stuff
Twitter
together.
and send me the links when it comes
I
out.
have the on audio. I hope the video came out. It's the first time I use Zoom for
Okay,
YouTube.
audio, whatever comes out, send me. I'll put it out.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you.
My
Bye-bye.
pleasure. Thank you. Bye bye.